The Green Wall. Why the Wehrmacht was a nightmare for the GI. Part 1. The Shock of Contact. Hello everyone, and welcome back. When we look at World War II movies today, we often see a standard narrative. The Americans arrive, they chew gum, they have endless supplies, and they roll over the Germans with overwhelming firepower. We see the Nazis as villains, but often as incompetent ones, stormtroopers who can't shoot straight. But the reality for the American GI in 1942 and 1943 was very, very different. When the United States entered the ground war in Europe, they were facing an enemy that had been fighting for 3 years. The German Wehrmacht had conquered Poland, France, Greece, and vast swaths of Russia. They were battle-hardened, cynical, and tactically sophisticated. The American soldier, by contrast, was green. He was well-fed, well-equipped, and notoriously overconfident. He thought he was going on a grand adventure to kick Hitler in the teeth. In this 3-part series, we're going to explore the brutal reality of fighting the Germans. We're going to look at the weapons that terrified the GIs, like the MG-42 and the 88mm flak. We're going to look at the German tactical genius of the Kampfgruppe. And we're going to answer the question, why did it take so long and cost so much blood to break the back of the German army? To understand the shock, we have to go back to the first major meeting. North Africa, Tunisia, February 1943. The Americans had landed in Operation Torch a few months earlier. They had faced the Vichy French, who surrendered quickly. The GIs thought this war was easy. They were driving around in the desert in their half-tracks, not digging foxholes, lighting cigarettes at night. They were acting like they were on maneuvers in Louisiana. Then they met the Afrika Korps, the Kasserine Pass disaster. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, looked at the American positions and saw amateurs. He decided to teach them a lesson. At the Kasserine Pass, the veteran German panzer slammed into the U.S. Second Corps. It was a slaughter. The American Stuart decks were popped like tin cans. The Shermans were outmaneuvered. The American commanders panicked. They tried to radio for artillery support, but the lines were cut. They tried to organize a counterattack, but the units got lost. The Germans didn't just defeat the Americans, they humiliated them. American soldiers abandoned their equipment and ran. Rommel famously said of the Americans, they have good equipment, but they don't know how to use it. They're like children playing with guns. For the average GI, Kasserine was a cold bucket of water. It destroyed the myth of American invincibility. It proved that enthusiasm wasn't enough. You were fighting men who had survived the frozen hell of Stalingrad and the heat of Tobruk. They knew how to kill, and they did it with a terrifying efficiency. The sound of death, the MG-42. If you ask any World War II veteran what they remember most about the Germans, they won't talk about politics. They will talk about a sound. Rarat. The sound of tearing canvas. The sound of a zipper being pulled violently. This was the Maschinengewehr 42, the MG-42. The American Browning machine gun fired about 500 to 600 rounds per minute. It went thump, thump, thump. You could hear the individual shots. The German MG-42 fired 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute. The bullets came out so fast that the human ear couldn't distinguish them. It was a continuous buzz. This weapon terrified the Americans. It was the backbone of the German infantry squad. American doctrine was based on the riflemen. The riflemen maneuvered and the machine guns supported them. German doctrine was the opposite. The machine gun was the god of the battlefield. The entire squad existed to carry ammo for the MG-42. When an American platoon walked into an ambush, the MG-42 would pin them down instantly. You couldn't lift your head. You couldn't move. The volume of fire was so intense that it chewed through brick walls and cut down trees. Psychologically, it was devastating. The U.S. Army actually had to produce training films telling soldiers, "Don't be afraid of the noise. Its bark is worse than its bite." The soldiers knew that was a lie. Its bite was lethal. The 88mm nightmare. Then there was the artillery. The Americans had great artillery. They had radio networks that could call down a rain of steel in minutes. But the Germans had the 88. The Flugabwehrkanone 1836. Originally, it was an anti-aircraft gun designed to shoot down bombers. But in 1940, Rommel realized it was the perfect tank killer. The 88mm shell traveled at supersonic speed. For a tanker, this was a nightmare. Usually you hear the boom of the gun, then the whistle of the shell. You have a split second to flinch. With the 88, the shell arrived before the sound. You would be driving your Sherman tank, and suddenly, clang! Your turret is blown off. Then a second later, you hear the bang of the gun firing. It was called the snap bang. The 88 could kill a Sherman from 2,000 meters away. Their Sherman's 75mm gun had to get within 500 meters to hurt a Tiger. This disparity created a deep sense of inferiority among U.S. crews. They called their tanks Ronsons, after the cigarette lighter, because they lit up the first time you hit them. They knew that every time they rolled out, the Germans could see them and kill them long before they could fight back. Auftragstaktik, the mission command. But it wasn't just the weapons. It was the leadership. The American Army was built on a rigid chain of command. Orders came from the top down. If the lieutenant died, the sergeant waited for orders. If the radio broke, the unit stopped. The Germans operated on a principle called Auftragtaktik, or mission-type tactics. The German high command told the junior officer what to do, but not how to do it. Take that hill. How you take it is up to you. This meant that German NCOs, or the sergeants and corporals, were incredibly independent. If their officer was killed, the sergeant took over instantly. If the unit was cut off, they formed a Kampfgruppe with whoever was nearby, a cook, a tank driver, an infantryman, and they kept fighting. This made fighting them incredibly frustrating for the Americans. You could smash a German battalion, shatter their command structure, cut their supply lines, and they would still counterattack you 10 minutes later. They were fluid, they adapted. The Americans, especially in the early days, were rigid. They followed the manual, and the Germans read the manual and set them traps for them. The sniper culture. There was also a difference in how the individual soldier fought. The American GI was often a citizen soldier. He wanted to do his job and go home. The German soldier, by 1944, had been indoctrinated for a decade. But more importantly, he was a master of camouflage. American veterans constantly complained about invisible snipers. The Germans mastered the art of the stay behind. They would leave a single sniper tied into a tree or hidden in a haystack as the American column moved past. He would wait for the officers. He would look for the man waving his arms or holding the map. Crack. The officer drops. The column halts. Panic. The Americans spray the woods with machine gun fire. The sniper is already gone, or he sits still, waiting for the next target. This constant fear of the unseen enemy wore down the nerves of the GIs. They started shooting at shadows. They burned out haystacks just in case. Transition to part 2. After the humiliation of Kasserine, the Americans learned. They fired incompetent generals. They brought in Patton. They learned to coordinate tanks and infantry. They pushed the Germans out of Africa. They fought their way up the mountains of Sicily and Italy. By June 1944, the American army was a different beast. It was massive, mechanized, and angry. But as they prepared to cross the Channel and land in Normandy, they were about to face a new challenge. The Germans knew they were coming, and they had prepared a landscape was designed for murder, the Bocage. In the next part, we are going to look at the hell of the hedgerows.
we're going to examine the psychological terror of the Tiger tank, the monster that took 5 Shermans to kill. And we're going to walk into the dark, frozen meat grinder of the Hjorten Forest, where the U.S. Army suffered its worst defeat in Europe, fighting an enemy they couldn't even see. The shock of contact was over. Now the war of attrition was about to begin. Make sure you subscribed, because part 2 is going to take us into the claustrophobic lanes of Normandy, where every field was a fortress.
The Green Wall. Why the Wehrmacht was a nightmare for the GI. Part 2. The Hedgerow Hell and the Forest of Death. Welcome back. In Part 1, we talked about the rude awakening the American Army received in North Africa. We talked about the terrifying sound of the MG-42 and the lethal reach of the 88mm anti-tank gun. But by June 1944, the Americans felt ready. They had successfully stormed the beaches of Normandy. They had breached the Atlantic Wall. They thought the hard part was over. They thought they would race across France, liberate Paris, and be in Berlin by Christmas. They were wrong. As soon as the American units moved inland from Omaha and Utah beaches, they ran into a landscape that seemed designed by the devil himself to stop an army. The Bocage. On the maps, it looked like farmland, little fields separated by hedges. But the reality on the ground was a tactical nightmare. These weren't garden hedges. They were ancient earthen walls, 4 to 6 feet high, topped with thick, tangled vegetation and trees that had been growing there for centuries. The roots were as hard as steel. The roads between these fields were sunken lanes, often lower than the fields themselves. They were tunnels of green. The chessboard of death. For the German defenders, the Bocage was a fortress. It turned every single field into a separate battle. A German platoon could hold up an entire American battalion for a day. Here's how they did it. They would dig into the corners of the hedgerow. They would cut small firing slits through the roots for their machine guns. They would pre-sight their mortars on the only entrance to the field. When the Americans tried to advance, they couldn't see anything. If they sent a tank, the tank would try to climb over the hedgerow. As it climbed, its nose went up, exposing its thin underbelly armor. A German soldier with a Panzerfaust, waiting just 10 yards away, would put a shaped charge right into the tank's fuel tank. The tank would burn, blocking the road. The infantry behind it would be trapped in the sunken lane, pinned down by mortar fire they couldn't locate. It was claustrophobic. It was slow. It was bloody. American commanders were baffled. Their superior air power was useless because the pilots couldn't see the Germans hiding under the thick canopy of leaves. Their artillery was ineffective because the earthen walls absorbed the shrapnel. It became a war of inches. The 3-field war, they called it. You fought all day, lost 50 men, and captured 3 fields. The morale of the GIs plummeted. They felt like rats in a maze, and the Germans were the cats waiting at every turn. Innovation under fire. The Rhino. This is where the American spirit of improvisation kicked in. The GIs realized they couldn't climb over the hedges. They had to go through them. A sergeant named Curtis Cullen came up with an idea. He took the steel girders from the Rommel's asparagus, the anti-invasion obstacles that the Germans had put on the beaches, and welded them to the front of a Sherman tank. They looked like giant tusks. They called it the Rhino tank. With these tusks, a Sherman could hit the hedgerow at 15 miles per hour and slice right through the earth and roots, bursting into the next field with its gun level and firing. This innovation, combined with a new tactic of coordinating infantry and tanks, finally allowed the Americans to break out of the Bocage in Operation Cobra, but the cost was staggering. The hedgerows of Normandy are watered with American blood. Tiger fever. The psychological monster. Once they broke out into the open country of France, the GIs faced a different kind of terror, the Panzer VI Tiger. we have to talk about the psychology of this tank. There were actually very few Tigers in Normandy. Most of the German tanks were Panzer IVs or Panthers, but to the average GI, every German tank was a Tiger. The reputation of this machine was so terrifying that it caused a condition known as Tiger fever. Reports from the time state that entire American convoys would halt and radio for air support if someone even thought they saw a Tiger on the horizon. Why? Because the Tiger was a monster. Its frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick. The standard American Sherman had a 75 millimeter gun. You could hit a Tiger from 500 yards away and the shell would just bounce off, clang, and then the Tiger would slowly turn its turret. Its 88 millimeter gun could slice through a Sherman like it was made of butter from a mile away. There is a famous rule of thumb from the war. It takes 5 Shermans shoved to kill 1 Tiger. The expectation was that the Tiger would destroy 3 or 4 of them before the 5th one could flank it and shoot it in the rear engine block. Imagine being a tank crewman in a Sherman. You know your tank is inferior. You know your armor is too thin. You know your gun is too weak. And you know that the Germans are better shots. It required a special kind of courage to climb into a Sherman in 1944. The Germans knew this. They used their heavy tanks as psychological weapons. They would park a single Tiger at a crossroads, and it would paralyze an entire American advance for hours. The Green Hell. The Hurtgen Forest. But if Normandy was bad, what came next was worse. In the autumn of 1944, the U.S. Army made a catastrophic mistake. They decided to attack through the Hurtgen Forest, just south of Aachen. They wanted to protect their flank before crossing the Rhine. It turned out to be the longest single battle in U.S. Army history, and it was a slaughterhouse. The Hurtgenwald was a dense, dark, ancient forest of fir trees. It was damp, cold, and foggy. The sun rarely touched the forest floor. It neutralized every advantage the Americans had. Air power, useless. The pilots couldn't see through the trees. Tanks, useless. There were only a few muddy trails, and the Germans had mined them all with Regal mines that could flip a tank over. Mobility, gone. It was a foot soldier's war. But the Germans had a weapon here that terrified the GIs more than anything else. Tree bursts. Normally, when artillery hits the ground, the dirt absorbs some of the explosion. If you're in a foxhole, you are relatively safe. In the Hurtgen Forest, the German artillery fuses were set to detonate the shells in the treetops, 50 feet above the ground. The shell would explode, shattering the massive pine trees. It wasn't just metal shrapnel raining down. It was jagged splinters of wood, big as spears. There was no cover. If you were in an open foxhole, the shrapnel came straight down on top of you. The GIs had to learn to build roofs for their foxholes, logs and dirt, just to survive the shelling. The noise was deafening. The forest amplified the sound of the explosions. The darkness was constant. Casualties from combat fatigue, what we now call PTSD, skyrocketed. Men just broke. They went catatonic. They couldn't stop shaking. The Germans fought with a grim determination here. They were on German soil now. They weren't defending occupied France. They were defending their homes. General Walter Model, the German commander, used the terrain masterfully. He bled the American divisions dry. The 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Bucket, lost nearly all its frontline strength in the forest. For months, the U.S. Army fed men into this green meat grinder for almost no strategic gain. It remains one of the most controversial and bitter defeats in American military history. The invisible enemy. Mines and booby traps. Adding to the misery was the German genius for mines. The Germans developed the S-mine, Shrapnellmine, nicknamed the Bouncing Betty by the Americans. This was a sadistic weapon. When you stepped on the trigger, it didn't explode immediately. It fired a small charge that launched the mine about 3 feet into the air, waist height. Then it exploded,
It sprayed hundreds of steel balls horizontally. It was designed to maim, to castrate, and to gut. In the Hirten forest, the ground was sown with these mines. The Germans also booby-trapped everything. They left Lugers lying on tables. If you picked one up, a grenade exploded. They rigged cricket paintings on walls. If you straightened them, you died. They rigged toilet flush chains. This created a deep paranoia. The GI learned not to touch anything, not to open doors, not to trust the ground he walked on. Transition to Part 3. By December 1944, the American soldier was exhausted. He had fought through the hedgerows, survived the Tiger tanks, and bled in the Hirten forest. He thought the German army was finished. He thought they had no reserves left. He was looking forward to a quiet winter in the Ardennes, a ghost front where nothing ever happened. He was about to be the victim of the greatest intelligence failure of the war. The Germans were not finished. Hitler had scraped together his last reserves, his fanatical SS Panzer divisions, for one final desperate gamble: the Battle of the Bulge. In Part 3, and the final part of this series, we will look at the frozen hell of the Ardennes. We will examine the Malmedy massacre, where American prisoners were gunned down in a field. We will look at the terror of the V-1 and V-2 rockets raining down, and we will see how the American GI, pushed to the breaking point, finally found the strength to crush the Wehrmacht once and for all. Make sure you are subscribed. Part 3 is the climax of the war in the West. End of Part 2.
The Green Wall: Why the Wehrmacht was a Nightmare for the GI. Part 3. The Winter of Terror and the Final Collapse. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the final chapter of our series on the American experience fighting the Germans in World War II. In the first two parts, we witnessed the humiliation at Kasserine Pass, the terror of the hedgerows, and the meat grinder of the Hürtgen Forest. We saw how the GI learned, the hard way, to respect the MG-42, the 88mm gun, and the tactical genius of the German soldier. By December 1944, the American army was confident, perhaps too confident. They believed the Wehrmacht was broken. Intelligence reports stated that Germany had no fuel, no planes, and no reserves. The Allied commanders believed the war would be over in weeks. They sent their tired divisions to a quiet sector of the front in the Ardennes Forest, a place they called the Ghost Front, to rest and celebrate Christmas. They were walking into the greatest trap of the war. The Germans were not broken. Adolf Hitler had scraped together the last of his strength, his fanatical SS Panzer divisions, his new heavy tanks, and his jet aircraft, for one final desperate gamble. He didn't just want to stop the Americans, he wanted to break them. On the morning of December 16, 1944, the Ghost Front came alive. And for the next month, the American soldier would face the ultimate test of endurance, fighting not just a resurgent enemy, but the coldest winter in Europe in 20 years. The fog of war. The first thing that made the Battle of the Bulge a nightmare wasn't the tanks, it was the weather. The German attack was timed perfectly to coincide with a massive winter storm. Thick fog and heavy snow blanketed the Ardennes forest. For the Americans, this was catastrophic. Their greatest advantage, the U.S. Army Air Force, was grounded. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustang that usually terrified the German tankers couldn't fly. The American GIs in their foxholes were blind. They couldn't see the enemy coming until the Tiger tanks were literally on top of them. The noise was terrifying. The Germans used screaming minis, or Nebelwerfer rocket launchers, that made a horrific howling sound. Out of the white mist emerged the shapes of the King Tigers, 70-ton monsters that shrugged off bazooka rounds like mosquito bites. The inexperienced American units, the 99th and the 106th Infantry Divisions, were overrun. Thousands of men surrendered, the largest mass surrender of U.S. troops in the European theater. It looked like 1940 all over again. The Blitzkrieg was back. The Malmedy massacre, the war becomes personal. But this wasn't 1940, and the Germans weren't just the Wehrmacht anymore. The spearhead of the attack was the 1st SS Panzer Division led by Joachim Peiper. These were the fanatics. They had fought on the Eastern Front, and they brought the brutality of the Russian war to the West. On December 17, 1944, near the town of Malmedy, Peiper's unit captured a convoy of artillery observers
About 84 American prisoners were gathered in a field. They had surrendered. Their hands were up. Then the SS opened fire with machine guns. They walked among the wounded and shot them in the head. It was cold-blooded murder. A few Americans survived by playing dead in the snow. They escaped and brought the story back to the U.S. lines. News of the Malmedy massacre spread like wildfire through the American ranks. This changed the psychology of the war instantly. Before Malmedy, many GIs saw the Germans as honorable enemies. After Malmedy, the gloves came off. American commanders issued unofficial orders. No SS prisoners. The war became hateful. It became personal. The GIs realized they weren't fighting soldiers. They were fighting murderers. It hardened their resolve. Instead of running, they dug in. They decided that if they were going to die, they were going to take as many of these SS bastards with them as possible. Operation Greif, the paranoia. As if the tanks and the SS weren't enough, the Germans unleashed a psychological weapon that paralyzed the U.S. Army from within. Operation Greif, led by the famous commando Otto Skorzeny. The Germans took captured American jeeps, dressed English-speaking soldiers in American uniforms, and sent them behind American lines. Their mission was to switch road signs, cut telephone wires, and spread chaos. Rumors spread that thousands of these saboteurs were loose. A wild rumor even claimed that they were on their way to Paris to assassinate General Eisenhower. The result was total paranoia. Suddenly, no one trusted anyone. American military police set up checkpoints at every crossroads. They stopped generals. They stopped ambulances. To prove you were American, you had to answer trivia questions that no German would know. Who won the World Series? What is the capital of Illinois? Who is Betty Grable's husband? If you didn't know the answer, you were arrested. Even General Bradley was detained because he correctly identified the capital of Illinois at Springfield. The MP thought it was Chicago. For weeks, the massive U.S. logistics machine was slowed down by its own fear. The Germans had managed to turn the Americans against themselves.
But amidst the chaos and the retreat, one island of resistance held firm, the town of Bastogne. It was a vital road junction. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was rushed in by truck to hold it. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered 5-1. They had no winter clothes, low ammunition, and almost no medical supplies. The German commander sent a message demanding their surrender. The American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a one-word reply that has become legend. Nuts. The Germans were confused. Is that negative or affirmative, they asked. It means go to hell, the American officer explained. The siege of Bastogne proved to the Germans that the American soldier was not soft. The paratroopers froze in their foxholes, eating snow for water, but they didn't break. And then the weather cleared. On December 26, the sun came out. The Allied air power returned, the sky filled with P-47s. They smashed the German supply columns. General Patton's Third Army broke through the lines from the south. The German gamble had failed. They had used up their last reserves. The bulge was flattened. The jet age and the VO weapons. But amidst the chaos and the retreat, one island of resistance held firm, the town of Bastogne. It was a vital road juncture. The 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, was rushed in by truck to hold it. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered 5-1. They had no winter clothes, low ammunition, and almost no medical supplies. The German commander sent a message demanding their surrender. The American commander, General Anthony McAuliffe, sent back a one-word reply that has become legend. Nuts. The Germans were confused. Is that negative or affirmative? They asked. It means go to hell, the American officer explained. The siege of Bastogne proved to the Germans that the American soldier was not soft. The paratroopers froze in their foxholes, eating snow for water, but they didn't break. And then the weather cleared. On December 26th, the sun came out. The Allied air power returned. The sky filled with P-47s. They smashed the German supply columns. General Patton's Third Army broke through the lines from the south. The German gamble had failed. They had used up their last reserves. The bulge was flattened.
the jet age and V weapons. Even in defeat, the Germans had one last surprise. In the final months of the war, American pilots began to report seeing planes without propellers, planes that flew so fast they looked like a blur. The Messerschmitt ME-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was 100 miles per hour faster than the American Mustang. It shredded bomber formations. At the same time, the V-2 rockets were raining down on London and Antwerp. These were ballistic missiles that fell from the edge of space faster than the speed of sound. To the American GI, it was terrifying. It felt like fighting aliens. The Germans had technology from the future. But it was too little, too late. The Germans had the jets, but they didn't have the fuel. They had the rockets, but they didn't have the warheads to change the outcome. The Americans had something more boring but more effective. Logistics. They had endless trucks, endless gasoline, and endless replacements. The German war machine ran out of gas, literally. The crossing of the Rhine, the final psychological barrier. March 1945. The Americans reached the Rhine River, the mystical barrier of Germany. The Germans had blown all the bridges, or so they thought. At Rigamen, the Ludendorff Bridge was still standing. In a moment of incredible bravery, American troops raced across the bridge while German charges were exploding around them. The bridge held. The Americans poured into the heart of Germany. And here, the nature of the enemy changed. The elite panzer divisions were gone. The GIs were now fighting old men in the Volkssturm and terrified boys from the Hitler Youth. But they also faced the werewolf guerrillas, fanatics who promised to fight behind the lines. The fear of snipers and booby traps remained until the very last day. The horror of the camps. But the hardest thing about fighting the Germans wasn't the combat. It was what they found at the end of the road. April 1945. American units liberated Orjov, Buchenwald, and Dachau. The hardened soldiers, men who had seen their friends blown into pieces on Omaha beach and frozen in the Ardennes, broke down and wept. They saw the piles of skeleton-like bodies. They smelled the crematoria. General Eisenhower ordered every soldier in the area to tour the camps. He wanted them to see why they were fighting. This was the final psychological shock. The GIs realized that the clean professional Wehrmacht they had fought was the shield for a regime of absolute evil. It gave them a grim satisfaction. They knew they had destroyed a monster. Why was it so hard? So why was fighting the Germans so hard? It wasn't because they were supermen. They made mistakes. Their leadership was delusional. It was hard because the German soldier was a professional. He was trained to take initiative. He fought with a tactical flexibility that the rigid American command structure struggled to match in the early years. It was hard because of their weapons. The MG-42, the 88, the Panther tank were often technically superior to American equipment. And it was hard because of fanaticism. Especially in the final year, the Germans fought with the desperation of men who knew their crimes were unforgivable and who were terrified of what the Russians would do to their families. But the American GI adapted. He learned to use artillery to crush the 88s. He learned to weld steel teeth onto his tanks to conquer the hedgerows. He learned to endure the cold of the bulge. The U.S. Army that entered the war in 1942 was a group of amateurs. The U.S. Army that stood on the Elbe in 1945 was the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. They won not because they were better at drilling or marching, but because they were free men who learned faster than the slaves of a dictatorship. Thank you for joining me on this 3-part journey through the European theater. If you enjoyed this deep dive into military history, please hit that like button and subscribe. And tell me in the comments, what is the one weapon or battle of World War II that fascinates you the most? Is it the Tiger tank? The B-17 bomber? Let me know, and we might cover it in the next documentary. Until then, keep history alive. End of series.